One of the journalists behind that reporting, State Department reporter Eric Martin, joins us now. Also joining us is Bloomberg Jerusalem reporter Dan Williams. We're so happy to have both of you. Eric, I'm going to start with you. Should you be on a plane? Should you not be on a plane?
We're glad to have him here.
We are glad to see you. But to this timing issue, I mean, this is such a fast-moving story. As we were sitting here, our Mideast colleagues flagged these comments where the Iran Foreign Ministry spokesman said, regarding the exact timing of the signing of the memorandum, we must wait. Although it will not be tomorrow. The possibility that it could take place in the coming days is not ruled out. However, due to the other side's, read U.S., instability in making any statements about this process, caution must be exercised. We've seen similar messaging from White House officials saying the other side needs to stop leaking. We've seen criticism about leaks from the Vice President, J.D. Vance. Eric, where are we? Is this going to happen, or have we made much ado about nothing yet again?
Sure, Christina. So I think that the where of this, in terms of where this gets signed, is much less important than the what, particularly for the Trump administration. And so finally getting to that deal, which we've heard President Trump say dozens of times since April 7th or April 8th, that this deal was a few days away or was kind of just around the corner. Finally getting to that deal to reopen the strait and to end the blockade would be a big development here. And so I think that, as with everything with this process, we were a couple of months ago, I was in Islamabad and connecting with you guys from there and talking about the latest just hours after Vice President Vance had sat down with his Iranian and Pakistani counterparts. If we finally get to a deal here, it seems likely that it could take a little bit longer than, say 24 hours. I mean, that's just been the way that's been the trend for everything that's happened on this file over the last several months. And so it certainly makes sense that it could take a little bit longer than some of the most optimistic predictions about 24 hours or so.
Dan Williams, let me turn to you. From your perch in Jerusalem, I'm eager to hear sort of how the Israeli government is thinking about this as it all unfolds. We know that Prime Minister Netanyahu would be, if not eager for more strikes, would support more strikes on Iran, and he's very much on the margins of these negotiations that are taking place between the U.S. and Iran. What is the government's perspective on the prospects of this happening here within the next 24 or 48 hours?
Well, since details of this deal emerged just in the last 24, 48 hours, the official public statements have been very spare. The Prime Minister Netanyahu put out, I think, all of 2 statements. His defense minister put out 1 statement. The rest of the usually loquacious Israeli cabinet is avoiding the media so far. There's something of a sullen public silence here. I imagine behind the scenes, the leaders here are working the phones with the Trump administration, trying to figure out what is included in this deal, whether there's any wriggle room, whether there's any way of toughening up some of the terms. The Israelis are generally not happy with this. As you noted, there was a willingness here to go back to war in the absence of a deal that would satisfy the original conditions, demands set both by the Israelis and the Americans at the outset of this war. I mean, the Israelis aren't looking for more war. They are looking for a diplomatic conclusion that would preclude future war, as they would put it. And what they worry about is effectively this deal would leave Iran with vestigial, at least, capacity to re-pursue its nuclear program, to rebuild its ballistic missile program, to come up with the funding eventually for its regional proxies, and essentially empower it in the face of an unprecedented joint campaign against it by the world's superpower and the premier military power of the Middle East, Israel. The optics here are very difficult for Israel, and the possibility that the terms of this deal may not satisfy its bottom line, its bottom threshold in terms of what it would consider a satisfactory outcome to this war.
Well, Dan, the terms of the deal have been a bit difficult for even some hardliners on the right here in the U.S. To stomach, because it looks like they will resemble the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which we know Benjamin Netanyahu was openly very against. And you flagged to us this morning some tweets from a right-wing politician there in Israel talking about the emerging deal with Iran is a total victory for the Ayatollahs. It's a catastrophe from Israel's perspective, and blaming the prime minister. Does this create an even bigger political liability for him domestically as well?
Absolutely. We're 4 months away from an Israeli election. It's going to be tightly contested, as they often are in Israel. This time, it's a re-election bid for Netanyahu, who was already Israel's longest-serving leader. I think it's clear that he had a very different outcome in mind. The original scheduling had, within that 6-week window, the initial 6 weeks of the war, produced enough internal damage to the Iranians to bring about an organic downfall of the regime. Afterward, he was to have hosted Trump, who was due to receive the Israel Prize in Israel, and that would have really set him up for re-election. In the absence of something that conclusive, and keep in mind there are still live fronts in Lebanon, which, by the way, is not disconnected to these Iran talks, given that Iran's looking out for Hezbollah. And even in Gaza, where this war began 2.5 years ago, Netanyahu's going to have a lot of explaining to do to the electorate. He promised total victory. Israelis are exhausted. They've been bloodied. They've lost a lot in terms of international prestige, in terms of treasure and lives. And yet they're not really seeing that conclusion, any satisfactory conclusion in the offing. It's something he's going to have to try very hard to explain.
Eric, you spend your days going through detailed diplomatic cables, looking at documents, looking at deals. This is something unique. This is one page, I gather, maybe a couple more, but 14 points as we understand it from that semi-official news agency. I was struck by something in Bloomberg's reporting recently that a person familiar with these deliberations said the memorandum would be open to interpretation in certain areas, including what the reopening of Hormuz would mean in practice. It makes me wonder sort of how cohesive, how long-lasting this document is likely to be. We're talking about a fairly short time horizon here, 60 days, should this be signed and approved by both sides. How much credence should we give a document like this? We've seen a very messy ceasefire over these last few months.
David, in some ways, a document like this is a starting point for the tough negotiations to come. And so it doesn't deal in detail with the nuclear program. It's something I was talking the other day with Aaron David Miller, who is a former advisor to the State Department on negotiations regarding the Middle East. And he said this is really buying a ticket to the next tough negotiation, in that, you have things that each side is going to try to portray to their domestic constituencies as a win, but certain things like exactly, what disposing of nuclear material means, in whether that's downblending or moving material out of the country, as well as what reopening the strait means. I mean, does that mean that reopening with some degree of Iranian monitoring or control, or does that mean going back to February 27th? So these are questions that are somewhat open, as the officials told us, somewhat open to interpretation, but that's both a feature and a flaw, right? I mean, that's something that allows each side to sell this to their constituencies and to citizens as a win, but there's also room there for misunderstanding and for disagreement and conflict if one side feels like the other is violating something that they had committed to.
Eric, I also want to ask you about who the main players are here, because very openly we're seeing acknowledgement from the different sides that Pakistan is involved and has been mediating this. But I'm hearing, as I'm sure you are as well, from sources in the region, there are other regional players helping, assisting, advising, and possibly going to this signing ceremony if indeed it does happen. We're now hearing it could be a digital signing, not quite sure what that entails. Who are the regional players helping make this potentially happen? And then who are the negotiators? Is it still just mainly Witkoff and Kushner? We saw this Axios report that they'd actually gone to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which is a nuclear facility, to kind of buff up on their nuclear knowledge. Are they still leading it, and does the president still have faith in them?
Well, in terms of the intermediaries who we're seeing, certainly all countries in the region have an interest in and are invested in seeing this peace process come to fruition, but they also have to have ongoing relationships with Iran. So we've seen, we had reporting from colleagues earlier this week about UAE having meetings with the Iranians for the kind of highest level meetings that we've had since the beginning of the war, to try to calm some of the tensions, lingering tensions between those two countries. Of course, we saw Iran, after the U.S. and Israeli strikes, lashing out and hitting civilian targets in the UAE. We've also heard about a role for Qatar in this process and being involved. So even though Pakistan has been the host to the negotiations that we saw in April and has been the one that's had its highest level officials going to Tehran to deliver messages or using phones in Pakistan to deliver those messages and then taken by courier to Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader in this process that takes days. So we've seen that from several countries involved there. And then, to your question about who from the U.S. is involved, we've very much seen still the vice president ultimately in the lead on this, but the details being negotiated by Witkoff and Kushner. We had some reporting that there was the potential for an in-person signing ceremony, perhaps in Geneva, and perhaps as soon as Sunday. That now seems to have been that speculation tamped down a little bit, such that we're now expecting this could take several more days, and that it could be this virtual kind of ceremony or virtual signing that the Pakistanis and Iranians have mentioned.
Dan, let me turn to you lastly here. We were talking about, you brought up Lebanon just a moment ago, and of course that's a roiling conflict still, despite the diplomatic efforts that we've seen engineered or tried to be engineered here in recent weeks. Where does that stand now, and what's your understanding of the degree to which that would be a part of any memo of understanding that's signed here?
Well, if you ask the Iranians, Lebanon has to be part of this. They've frequently and consistently called for a ceasefire, an end of war deal to apply to all fronts. That's code for Lebanon, specifically the front of warfare between Israel and Hezbollah, which is really Iran's main ally, a very efficient, very well-armed guerrilla force and political force in Lebanon. The Israelis have ruled this out. While Iran is their arch foe, the overarching threat to their security, Hezbollah is the most immediate, literally on their northern border, at least until they pushed Hezbollah back with that invasion launched pretty much in parallel with the war against Iran over these months. The Israelis now have expanded a border security zone, what they call a buffer zone in southern Lebanon. That led to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Lebanese civilians. It's also effectively driven Hezbollah north and disarmed Hezbollah to a large degree. Israel has no intention, it says, of withdrawing from that. It may delimit its attacks to that zone and hold off on attacking Hezbollah in Beirut, in the Lebanese interior. But that really looks likely to be a major bone of contention there. It's very important for the Iranians symbolically in terms of their power projection, in terms of their influence in Levant on the Mediterranean coast. It's very important for the Israelis in terms of security of up to 2 million of their northern residents who, until very recently, were in range of Hezbollah rocket fire and at risk of seeing a Hezbollah invasion of the kind Hamas pulled off on October 7th, 2023. So Lebanon really will be a sticking point. It seems the Israelis managed last week through sheer firepower to assert what they call their right to continue fighting there against Hezbollah, if not in Beirut, then in the south. Time will tell whether they will also work that into this deal, that exception, that lacuna for Lebanon into whatever's signed between the Americans and Iran.